today's Mindful Monday. Today's Everyday Alex. And first is the schedule for this week. There's going to be, obviously, a live episode today. And then there's going to be the next episode of the In Therapy series, which is coming out tomorrow. This is the first half of Sally's first in-person session with me. And then the second half of that will come out next week. So tomorrow's episode is exploring anger. And I think anger is a topic a lot of people, particularly now, are probably struggling with. I think a lot of people have a lot of feelings and emotions that are coming up. In fact, we're going to get into that a little bit in today's episode. Because I want to talk about cultivating tolerance. One of the things that I think is starting to happen, and I think it's going to happen probably a lot more in the coming few weeks, is we're starting to see a sort of polarizing of attitudes on social media, and I'm sure in other places as well, related to COVID-19 and what's happening. And I think there's been a sort of rare moment of unity that's been there over the last few weeks, where people have sort of accepted that we need to kind of stay home and, you know, protect the NHS, save lives, and that whole story. And I think that's still entirely true and valid. And people are starting to increasingly feel the difficulty of what that involves, and also for those people who they've got a significant impact in terms of either their businesses or their jobs or their livelihoods. And it just starts to feel like there's more of a kind of fragmentation and more of a division that's coming up. And it feels like we're on the sort of edge of what we tend to see a lot around elections, where you tend to see this really kind of raging kind of total absence of tolerance, I guess, is what I would say, where there's this kind of fighting of perspectives and worldviews. And I know that part of what's been happening for people with chronic illnesses at the moment is that there's been a sense that the world started to have a taste or an insight into what it's like to have your life heavily restricted. And I think people in some ways, perhaps not in other ways, but in some ways have felt quite seen and quite understood and quite sort of supported by that. And I think there's going to be some of the dropping off of some of that, particularly as in time, and I don't think we're there yet, but in time, as life starts to go back to normal, what does that mean for people whose lives are not going to go back to normal, that are still going to feel isolated or trapped or limited because of physical energy and physical capacity? And so I felt that a topic that would be good to explore would be this sort of idea of how do we cultivate more tolerance? How do we get to see different perspectives, different ways of seeing things from a place of openness, and not in a place where we just capitulate and drop our own perspective, but in a place where we can be absolutely kind of committed to what's true for us, but also be open to and sensitive towards the perspectives of others. I think this is also true people living with chronic illness that feel misunderstood by medical practitioners or indeed sometimes friends and family. Anyone who's ever felt misunderstood, and I'm sure that's most people, I guess I'm speaking to. And the first thing I wanted to say here is that certainly my experience is that it's always, nearly always, a better place to meet the world from is a place of compassion. Doesn't mean we have to agree with others. We may fundamentally disagree with others, but to still do the best we can to come from a place of compassion and of basic kindness towards other people. You know, and it's sort of that thing where, you know, you're driving around the roundabout and someone cuts you up, and in that moment, how do you respond to that? Like, what do you make that mean? Do you respond to that from a point of view of you've been violated, someone's not seen you, and maybe they got some history around not feeling seen and not being kind of validated by others, and you go into a kind of rage and an anger? Or do you sort of come from the place of thinking, wow, someone drives like that, if they have a basic lack of awareness and kindness towards others, they must have really bad relationships. Like the people that they want to have closeness and love from, they must be pretty bad relationships, because their values are, I don't care about you, what I want to get is more important. And when we live our life in that way, first we tend to attract more people towards us that resonate with that dynamic, but we also just tend to treat people badly. And the world has an amazing way of reflecting back what we give. So when we behave in an unkind, ungenerous way, we tend to attract more of that back from other people. So what I find is very helpful is when someone acts in a way which is just fundamentally kind of ungenerous or kind of indecent, or just kind of doesn't kind of show they're living from the sorts of values of how I like to approach the world. I sort of remind myself that so many of the things in my life that I'm grateful for, so many things in my life that I think are of real value, are my human relationships and the people that I work with and my family and the people that I've really invested in and loved and cared about and gone to great lengths to support and invest in those relationships. That's why I have many people that I've worked with for many, many, many years. There's a number of people in Optimal Health Clinic that have been there well over 10 years, and I take great pride in that. And that's about when it really comes down to it, actually caring about people. So when we live from a place where our kind of default thing is to try to meet the world from a place of compassion and a place of kindness, firstly, our life starts to reflect that. When we get drawn into kind of point scoring and kind of vomiting out our own emotional reactions at others, we tend to attract more of that, and we tend to perpetuate that cycle. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to ignore what's true for us. It's possible to absolutely stand up for what's true and take a strong and a firm and in a potentially immovable position, but not do it from a place of hate or from a place of anger or from a place of righteousness, that I'm right and you're wrong, and until you know that I'm right and you're wrong, then I'm going to keep telling you that. I don't know about you, but my experience is when I feel attacked, I tend to defend. So if I feel that someone's going at a character assassination, they're attacking me or attacking people I love and care about, whether or not I act on it, my instinctive response is I want to protect and defend. It's like, as soon as you start accusing somebody, they start looking for the reasons why and how they can defend themselves. So when we're looking at cultivating tolerance, part of it is as soon as we attack, as soon as we make other people wrong for their perspective, almost inevitably, they will start to defend and they will start to push back. And that doesn't mean that we can't ask provocative questions. It doesn't mean that we can't present evidence. It doesn't mean that we can't fundamentally hold a different perspective. But the more we can do that from a place of kindness, the more we can do that from a place of sensitivity, the more we tend to invite more of that from other people, the more we're able to have a kind of open, explorative dialogue with people, as opposed to just getting into loggerheads and getting into a war. One of the things that is, I think, controversial to say, but I think is fundamentally true, is sometimes the people which preach the most about tolerance and kindness are the least tolerant of others' perspectives. It's like they're preaching this view of tolerance and everyone has to listen, but you must listen to my view of tolerance because I'm right and you're wrong. And you sort of start to see that the place they're coming from is not a place of tolerance and openness and kindness. So if it is the case that in the coming few weeks and months we start to see more of a fragmentation, for example, in social media about COVID-19, and more of a kind of wars of different ideas and perspectives. And, you know, I'm using that sort of as a microcosm, or maybe it's a macrocosm, but as an example, let's say, of those of you that perhaps who have been ill, that have been started to feel validated and started to be seen, and then others' lives start to move on and your life doesn't start to move on and you feel isolated, you feel alone. It's doing the best you can to cultivate tolerance. And I very deliberately labeled this video Cultivating Tolerance. Tolerance isn't something that necessarily just appears. It's like growing plants that you've got to put work in. You've got to actively work to cultivate that. I'm not talking about cultivating, letting go of everything you believe to be true to get agreement. I'm not talking about having a big helper pattern or big peacekeeper pattern where you just have to listen to everyone else and ignore what you know to be true. Absolutely saying come from a place of conviction and strength and truth for yourself. And the more we can practice cultivating tolerance, having compassion, listening to others, we're much more likely to cultivate healthy dialogue. And we're also much less likely to go into a stress response. Like the more we go to war with others, even if it's just a war of ideas, the more the nervous system reacts to that. The more we work on not being reactive, listening to others' perspectives, not becoming righteous, not sort of trying to point score in those positions, the more actually others are more willing to listen to us. In fact, the more we listen to someone else's perspective and we cultivate a sense of trust and openness, the more likely they then are to listen to the perspectives that we hold. And I think one of the things that COVID-19 perhaps tells us more than anything is how little we all actually know about this situation. And I think one of the things that I find a little concerning is how people will read one or two sources of the same set of ideas, and then they have utter conviction that that's how it is. And there's a shaming and a making wrong of others. And I think when you're dealing with what's called wicked problems, like really complicated problems with many, many, many levels of complexity to them, more than ever, we need to have an openness and we need to be able to listen to other ideas and perspectives. I think it's also when we feel reactive and we feel triggered, I think it's also a great opportunity to use practices. Meditation practice, if you've got things like the stop process, things like EFT, that when you feel charged, when you feel unseen, when you feel angry, when you feel reactive, it's a great opportunity to use the tools, to use the techniques that you may have. So I'm curious in the comments, what helps you cultivate tolerance? What do you notice when you feel triggered by others, when you feel reactive, when you feel yourself getting sucked into a kind of debate and anger or whatever else? What helps you cultivate tolerance? What helps you come from a more helpful place? Like, what do you notice changes those dynamics with other people? So I'd be curious to share that in the comments. So one of the things that I would certainly say from my own experience is the more reactive that I feel, the more charged that I feel, the more I know that I've got something to go and work on. Doesn't necessarily mean that my opinion's wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't want to have a discussion or a debate or I want to try and challenge someone's perspective. But the more emotionally riled, the more triggered that I'm feeling, that's me, that's my reaction that's being triggered. Now, that doesn't mean that reaction may not be justified. It may be entirely justified. And it's still something that's helpful to see. It's still something that's helpful to work with. So I hope that's been helpful. As I said at the start, tomorrow we're going to have the next episode of In Therapy. And we've got, I think it's a really good episode. It's the first in-person session for Sally. If you haven't already, do check out. We've got 4 episodes already available to watch on YouTube. So if you haven't already, please do check them out. And then we're aiming to have another live episode of Everyday Alex on Wednesday. I think we'll have a pre-recorded episode on Thursday, and then I think the bank holiday weekend will be off, so then we'll be back with the next episode of In Therapy. The second half of Sally's first in-person session will be coming the following Tuesday. Thanks for watching.